This is the New York State Capitol in Albany, the state capitol located in upstate New York. On January 15th, a special resolution was introduced in the State Assembly Chamber, one that had passed the House of Representatives and was pending in the Senate. It garnered so much attention that even members of the Korean National Assembly were also present. It was a resolution to officially commemorate March 1st Independent Movement Day in the state of New York. A century ago, on March 1st, 1919, a young girl named Yu Kwan-soon laid down her life for Korea's freedom. The day of the nonviolent revolution, in which the cries of millions overpowered guns, has become a day to be remembered by the entire world. The desperate cries that resounded across Korea on that day in 1919 have been given a special meaning by the Congress of another nation. The resolution was passed with the unconditional support of 150 congresspersons. Recognizing the need to commemorate the centennial of the March 1st independence movement, peaceful resistance unprecedented in world history, the resolution was again passed unanimously by 63 senators. The March 1st independence movement is no longer just the painful history of the Korean people. Now, every year on March 1st, residents of New York, too, will commemorate the nonviolent fight for human rights.
Korean independence, and it talks about the contributions that the Korean American community has provided for people not only in New York City and New York State, but throughout the country. It talks about the arrival of immigrants to Hawaii in 1903, and it commemorates the growth in the Korean American population. And
3.1절
Originally named Yu Kwan-soon Day, the day was changed to March 1st Independence Movement Day to commemorate all individuals who were involved and to celebrate its centennial. This feat was made possible thanks largely to Ron Kim, a Korean-American representative.
I think it's tremendously important for not just Koreans and Korean Americans, but the rest of the world to recognize the sacrifice that Yu Kwan-soon had made for all humanity, not just Koreans. Her bravery, her spirit, her ability to resist under those pressures, even as a teenage girl, to go door to door and mobilize and resist. Even when she was in prison, behind prison, she was able to go to prison cell to spread the word of freedom, of pride. I mean, that's something that anyone, for any child growing up, should look up to and realize that's the kind of leadership that this world needs.
The adoption of the resolution was an achievement of Congressman Kim and the Korean residents in the community. They took the time to meet with each member of the Congress and explain the historical value of Yu Kwan-soon and the March 1st independence movement. In the process, a number of them sympathized with the cause and stepped forward as co-sponsors. Thanks to the interest and effort of many, a day has been designated to commemorate the movement. What's more, school textbooks in the state of New York will now teach about Yu Kwan-soon and the independence movement, history that will now be remembered by even the American posterity. Json was a 500-year-old dynasty with its own unique language and culture. But it was colonized by Japan, who wanted to use it as a logistics base. It all started with the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1904, which was followed by the Ulsa Treaty of 1905. The latter robbed Korea of its diplomatic sovereignty. Then in 1910, Japan declared Korea as its colony with a treaty that wasn't even stamped with Korea's national seal, and dared to raise the Japanese flag in front of Korea's Central Royal Palace. At the time of the March 1st independence movement, a new international order had taken root. In China, the Qing dynasty was brought down by the Xinhai Revolution, giving rise to the Republic of China. Russia emerged as a socialist state after its feudal system was struck down by the February Revolution. The idea of national self-determination, set forth by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, encouraged small, weak nations to dream of independence. This high-rise residential building on West 34th Street of New York City is where Hotel McAlpin once stood. It was the venue for the conventions of the League for Small and Subject Nationalities in 1917 and 1918. Korean independence associations sent representatives to these events to inform the world of Japan's illegal annexation of Korea.
I think there's a lot of significance to March 1st, to the March 1st movement in Korea. You had then this, people were actively trying to restore Korean sovereignty, but, and you had already the establishment of a national consciousness, but it became a mass movement.
So how exactly did the March 1st revolution begin? It all began here at Chungang High School 100 years ago. Behind the schoolyard, which was the first place where copies of the Declaration of Independence were scattered, was a night duty room that served as the center of operations. In January 1919, Song Kye-baek, who had been studying in Tokyo, paid a visit to his alma mater with a draft of the February 8th Declaration of Independence. From that day, he worked with the principal and a teacher in the night duty room to organize the March 1st independence movement. They approached Chundogyo leader Son Byung-hee, who had been leading the independence movement in the religious sector, and named the 33 national representatives. Then, they drew up a plan for a massive demonstration that would mobilize religious leaders, students, and ordinary citizens. The Pukchon area in Seoul is home to a number of important sites where the March 1st independent movement was organized, including the Chungang High School, the site of the house of Son Byung-hee, the Chundogyo Central Temple, and the printing house, Posongsa. Now occupied by a museum, this is where the house of Son Byung-hee, one of the 33 national representatives, once stood.
이 집 뒷방에 있는 터의 방에서 그 2월 28일 날 모여서 도장도 찍고 최종적으로 거기서 이제 30사람들이 모여가지고 거기서 논의를 했죠.
The night before the big day, the national representatives met here for the first time. Hearing that the students were planning to gather at Tapgol Park the next day, they decided to read the Declaration of Independence at Taehwagwan instead, worried of a possible disturbance. The Declaration of Independence was drafted by Che Nam's son, a great writer of the time. Because he was on a blacklist, he composed it while hiding in the house of a friend who was married to a Japanese. The Declaration clearly stated the purpose of the March 1st independence movement, declaring Korea as an independent state and defining the movement as a fight for the equality of all humans and Korea's right to ensure its survival. The Declaration was printed by Posongsa, a printing house run by Chundogyo. Although the area is now the front yard of Chogyesa Temple, and only a stone marks the spot where it once stood, Posongsa used to be quite a large printing house, publishing a weekly Chundogyo magazine. The printing house was actually a hideout for a secret anti-Japanese society. They printed the declaration on the pretext of working on something else, but were almost caught, in which case everything would have ended in vain.
이제 밤에 이제 인쇄기도라는 소리를 하니까 이제 그 아주 유명한 고등계 형사잖아요. 한국 사람으로서. 이제 돌아서 이제 딱 걸렸어요, 그걸 다. 근데 마침 이종일 선생이 거기 있다가 당신 기다리쇼. 그렇게 기다려가지고 이제 그 이종일 선생이 그 손병희 선생 집으로 달려가서 얘기를 한 거죠. 그러니까 그냥 한 뭉태기를 줬다는 거예요. 그게 얼마냐면 5,000원이요. 5,000원이요.
Averting the crisis by bribing the detective, they printed the declaration, and after a few narrow escapes, they managed to move the copies to Lee Jong-il's house. On February 28th, the next day, copies of the Declaration of Independence were distributed undercover across the nation through religious groups and students, all under the supervision of Lee Jong-il.
이게 이제 배부터라고 표지석은 여기 있지만은 당시에 여기 지금 여기 대교당 이거는 없었어요. 이건 건축 중에 있었고 여기 집에 한 12채 정도 되는 초가집들이 여기 있었어요. 저기 전동에서 저에서 안국동으로 해서 여기 제동으로 해서 이렇게 와가지고 이 집에다가 보관해서 거기서 이제 저기 평안도, 함경도, 그다음에 전라도 이렇게 배부를 한 거죠.
In addition to the declaration, Lee Jong-il had also prepared another publication. It was Tongnip Sinmun, Korea's first underground newspaper that was distributed together with the declaration. Given that the Japanese government had shut down the Korean press, publishing a national newspaper was nothing short of declaring a war against Japan. The contents of the Declaration of Independence were conveyed abroad to Shanghai and the U.S., which gave Korea a chance to proclaim through foreign media outlets its determination to regain its independence. At 2 p.m. on March 1st, 1919, the national representatives gathered at Taehwaguan to read the Declaration of Independence. They chose this venue because it was where all schemes that handed the Korean Empire over to Japan took place. By declaring Korea's freedom here, the national representatives aimed to undermine the legitimacy of those treacherous treaties. At 2 p.m., some 4,000 people gathered at Tapgo Park. After the Declaration of Independence was read aloud at the pavilion, the demonstrators poured out onto the streets, calling out for Korea's independence. A huge crowd had already formed in front of Deoksugung Palace to see the funeral of King Kojong. The crowd multiplied in an instant, all crying out "Manse!" And this historical scene was captured on film by Dr. Schofield, a professor of bacteriology who was teaching at the Severance Medical School.
사람이 너무 많으니까 파고다 공원보다 더 많게 보이니까 카메라 셔터를 누릴 장소를 찾을 수가 없었어요. 주변을 돌아보니까 2층 집이 눈에 띄었어요. 아래층은 빵집이었는데 그 집의 주인이 일본인이었습니다. 그런데 너무 정신이 없다 보니까 들어가게 되겠습니까? 라는 것도 묻지 않고 2층 집에 올라가서 베란다에서 셔터를 누르는데 뒤늦게 찾아온 일본인 아줌마가 빗자루를 들고 왔다고 그래요. 일본인의 입장에서 볼 때는 반역적인 만세 시위 아니겠습니까? 그 모습을 찍고 있으니까 일본 여성 주인은 그 빗자루로 스코필드 박사님을 쫓아냈다는 일화가 있습니다.
A few days prior to the demonstration, an independence activist asked Dr. Schofield to take photos of the protest on March 1st. He agreed and joined the demonstrators, risking his life to carry out the mission. This is a report submitted by the Japanese mayor of Seoul to the Japanese Minister of Home Affairs. It outlines the procession of the demonstrators from the moment they gathered at 2 p.m. at Tapco Park until evening. This is the March 4th issue of the Japan Advertiser, an American newspaper published in Japan. It was the first international paper to cover the movement. The top of its front page carries an article on the royal funeral for King Kojong, while at the bottom is a news brief on the demonstration. The lead story in its March 5th issue carried photos of Korean students being arrested. As titled "Snapshots of the Seoul Rioting" shows, the foreign media's response to Korea was apathetic at first. On March 9th, the New York Times published an article on how the American government refused to issue passports to 2 Koreans who were planning to attend the Paris Peace Conference. The individuals were none other than Lee Sing-man and Chung Han-kyung. The U.S. State Department denied Ri's request for a passport, stating that Dr. Ri's visit to Paris would be regrettable.
There was, I think, a lot of optimism about President Wilson's 14 points and his call for self-determination. Unfortunately, it seems that was not applied to Korea. It was applied to the defeated imperial powers in Europe. And so Korea was still recognized as being a Japanese possession, sadly. So self-determination did not apply to Korea. That was a failure of American foreign policy toward Korea.
Meet New York, with its stunning Brooklyn Bridge and the breathtaking cityscape of Manhattan. Sitting on the boundaries of 42nd Street, 7th Avenue, and Broadway, Times Square is famous for charging the world's highest advertisement fee. Not surprisingly, the buildings are adorned with all sorts of flashy billboards. This is the headquarters of the New York Times, the symbolic media outlet of a city that is known as the world's intersection of politics, culture, and press. It was acquired by Adolph Ochs in 1896, an era pervaded by yellow journalism. Pursuing sound journalism and undergoing complete reform, the New York Times soon emerged as a prominent daily newspaper. It was also unparalleled in its coverage of the March 1st independence movement. Starting with its first article on the subject on March 13, 1919, it continued to publish articles that were in favor of Korea's fight for freedom. It ran 300 to 400 articles on Korea between 1919 and 1922 every year. Japan faced growing criticism as American missionaries gave accounts of the Japanese government's atrocities and oppression. These individuals served as the messengers for the foreign media. Boasting a long history of 120 years, the Korean Christian Museum at Shil University is home to highly valuable artifacts. One of them is related to the March 1st independence movement. It was donated by an American missionary named Samuel Moffett, whose arrest by the Japanese government at the time of the demonstrations made the headlines abroad.
이 태극기는 1919년 3월 1일 평양에서 독립만세운동이 일어났을 때 그 군중들의 앞에서 개양되었던 그런 태극기고요. 3월 1일 3.1운동이 일어날 때, 독립만세운동이 일어날 때 숭실학교 교정에 일단 개양되었다가 만세운동 그 시 군중과 함께 그 만세운동에 앞장섰던 그런 태극기입니다.
Shil University started out as a small study room, opened in 1897 by an American missionary. It was at the center of the March 1st independence movement in the Pyongyang region. Missionaries played a big part. In particular, missionary and principal Moffett was imprisoned for hiding the students who led the demonstration.
그런데 이제 3.1운동이 일어나고 나서 일본의 학생들을 검거하기 시작하자 자기네 집 사택에 숭실 중학교 대학생들이 중심인데요. 그 학생들을 가택에 숨겨줬습니다. 그래서 가택 은닉죄로 해서 일본 경찰한테 체포되고 투옥된 그런 사례가 있었습니다.
On April 13, 1919, the Bisbee Daily Review, based in Arizona, published an article titled Korean Independence Proclamation in U.S. It stated that the English version of the Declaration of Independence was delivered not only to the U.S., but also to countries like Britain, France, and Italy. An AP news correspondent named V.S. McClathy first introduced the English version of the document in the U.S. It involved a covert operation in which he had to meet the carrier in Tokyo to escape the scrutiny of the Japanese government. Thanks to his efforts, the foreign media was able to publish news on Korea's fight for freedom and its spirit of independence. After entering the U.S., the declaration was distributed to the press in Hawaii in March and the San Francisco press on April 2nd. On June 15th, the New York Times even published the full text of the declaration. Dr. Hong San-pyo, who studies historical records from the U.S. and other countries in relation to the March 1st independence movement, shed some light on how Japan responded. As time passed and it became clear that it was losing the battle in the press, Japan began publishing a number of state-run newspapers that criticized Korea's fight for independence in an attempt to tip the scales in its favor. The Osaka Shinbun and the Seoul Press, an English newspaper, are two examples.
난동이 민족 운동인가 이런 뜻이잖아요, 그죠?
The Seoul Press, issued by the colonial government, was aimed at denigrating Korea's independence movement and questioning its legitimacy. It did not, however, have much effect.
제한 선교사들이었죠. 현장에서 직접 보고 경험을 했기 때문에 민감하게 반응을 했고 그러한 보고 사항이 미국 선교 본부 쪽으로 그대로 전달이 됐었습니다. 그래서 그 선교사의 보고를 무시할 수 없었기 때문에 미국 기독교단이 교단 차원에서 직접 움직이면서 한국 문제에 대한 관심을 갖고 움직이기 시작을 했었습니다.
The Presbyterian Historical Society is located in Philadelphia. Serving as the archives for the Presbyterian Church of the U.S., it has been sharing with the world various materials related to the church since 1852. Upon the official request of the Korean government to mark the centennial of the independence movement, it has recently been looking for the records that American missionaries left behind at the time. There is a huge volume of letters and reports sent by the American missionaries who were dispatched to Korea 100 years ago and faced and witnessed all kinds of persecution. They are vivid testimonies of how cruelly the Japanese government tried to snuff out the independence movement. An eyewitness account of how the Japanese authorities broke the arms and legs of their prisoners and killed people with guns and bayonets. This one criticizes Japan's brutal response to the non-violent demonstrators, who only shouted "Manse" while waving the Korean flag. This is the much-reported account of how a Japanese policeman cut off the arm of a girl and, when she picked up the manifesto with her other hand, cut off the other arm as well. Another harsh criticism of how Japan was treating the Korean people in the most brutal and barbaric way possible, much like Germany and Turkey. In accordance with the principle of the separation of church and state, at first the missionaries were involved only in educational and missionary activities, with no political intervention whatsoever. However, as Japan's oppression grew harsher, their Christian conscience no longer allowed them to ignore the violence. The missionaries began to appeal to the foreign media and the international community. They also published a booklet titled The Korean Situation, a compilation of reports written by missionaries in Korea. In particular, Dr. Schofield, who was an outspoken champion of Korea's fight for independence, criticized Japan's atrocities in his writing titled An Unquenchable Flame, and set forth the direction that Korea must take to overcome its hardships. The role played by foreign journalists was just as important. A journalist named Frederick Mackenzie wrote Korea's Fight for Freedom, in which he described Japan's brutality and how, in spite of it, the Korean people were responding with a peaceful civic movement that was astounding the world. As can be seen, the records left behind by missionaries were crucial in informing the international community of Japan's atrocities and Korea's yearning for independence. The March 15th issue of the B. Omaha carried the story of a girl with a severed arm, which surfaced in a number of accounts given by missionaries. Titled "Japanese Soldiers Cut Off Hands of Korean Girl," the article describes how a Korean independence activist who arrived in the U.S. on March 14th told the story as an example of Korea's independence movement. The martyr in the article, which spoke volumes about Japan's cruelty and Korea's passion for freedom, really did exist. In Yosu, Korea, there's an independence movement monument that shows exactly what happened on that day.
그 만세를 부르고 갔을 때 일본 헌병 기마 헌병이 중단하라 그랬음에도 불구하고 이 운동을 하는 그 스피아 학생들이 그냥 계속적으로 만세를 부르니까 그냥 총을 쏘도 안 듣고 그래서 이 일본 여기서 그리면서 와가지고 그냥 팔을 팍 자르니까 떨어진 팔이 잘려져 있는 이 상태에서도 자기 손을 잡는 게 이 태극기를 다시 이 손으로 잡고 오른손을 잡고 또 대한독립 만세를 크게 외치니까 그 일본 헌병들조차도 와 저렇게 저런 사람이냐고 기가 죽어가지고 이제 그대로 안부 그 독립운동 그 이상 제지를 하지 않았다.
At the time, Yoon Hyung-suk was a junior in Spear Girls High School, which had led the March 1st independence movement in Gwangju. Even among her classmates, her spirit of resistance was especially strong. On March 10th, a market day, she was at the forefront of the Mansei demonstration in Gwangju when she was attacked by a Japanese policeman with a sword. She lost her left arm and was blinded in her right eye, and ended up in prison for leading the demonstration. In the verdict from her trial that was posted at her school, the Japanese referred to her as Yoon Hyul-yo. Sentenced to 4 months in prison, she lost her vision in the other eye due to brutal torture. After liberation, Yoon Hyung-suk became a teacher, saying, "I have sacrificed my left arm for my country. Now I will sacrifice my other arm for the illiterate." Deprived of a chance to create a family of her own, she died a lonely death. Now her grave is visited only by her nephew. Her life is a reflection of Korea's tragic history that began with colonization and continued to a heartbreaking division. This is the burial plot for national martyrs at the Seoul National Cemetery. Here lies Dr. Schofield, who dedicated his life to fight for Korea's cause, and hence became the only foreigner to be buried together with Korean independence activists. Having come to Korea in 1916 to teach at the Severance Medical School, he set aside his academic interests when the March 1st independence movement started. He stood by the demonstrators and took photos of what was happening, and also provided support for the movement.
사실은 스코필드 박사님이 제암리뿐만 아니라 수촌리, 고줄이라는 여러 곳에서 학살당하고 불타버린 집들을 방문을 했는데 가셔서 울고 있는 사람들과 같이 앉아서 위로해 주었다는 것 같아요. 그중에 대표적으로 상징적으로 보여주고 있는 이 모녀의 사진은 정말 남편을, 아버지를 잃어버린 이 가족들, 한없이 슬퍼 빠진 가족들, 뭘 해야 될지 모르고 있는 수많은 사람들의 모습의 한 면을 보여주고 있지 않는가.
When the Japanese mercilessly murdered 23 residents of Jeamri for their involvement in the anti-Japanese movement and set the entire village on fire, Dr. Schofield ran to the scene and took photos to show the world what was happening. He also left behind permanent records like the massacre of Chayamni and report of the Sucheon atrocities. The Jeamni massacre was so horrendous that an AP news correspondent named Albert Taylor, missionary Underwood, and even the then U.S. Consul General visited the site. When the news reached abroad, it made headlines in several media outlets. Front pages of American and English-language Japanese newspapers were filled with an overview of the tragedy, as well as details of the damage suffered by the victims. Some even gave specific numbers. For example, that in the village of Hwasuri, 317 houses were set on fire, resulting in 39 deaths and 1,600 refugees. The JMNI March 1st Movement Martyrdom Hall keeps records related to the city of Hwasong. Rare materials on the region's independence movement can be found here.
이게 면사무소예요. 그래서 이렇게 점으로 찍은 거는 독립운동가들이 이제 참여해서 만세를 불렀다는 표시고요. 여기가 바로 이제 노구치가 죽은 걸로 추정되는 자료를 직접 그린 거죠.
This was an interrogatory recorded by the Japanese. It states that although it was a peaceful Teguki demonstration at first, it turned violent when the authorities fired from behind. In the end, Officer Noguchi was killed. There is also a map that pinpoints the site of his death, along with his autopsy report.
맞이해서 두 패로 갈라져요. 보면 이렇게 좌우로 나눠져 있잖아요. 주제소를 감싸고. 이 주제소를 중심으로 해서 좌우로 시위대가 두 패로 갈라져서 화수리 주제소를 에워싸는 거예요. 에워싸고 공격을 하니까 가하바다 순사가 총격을 가해서 저희 시위대가 3명이 숨지고 가하바다도 시위대에 의해서 이제는 그 타살이 되는 건데 이걸 하루 안에 이게 다 이루어지는 거예요. 아침부터 저녁까지.
Here is map number 1 of Songsan-myeon of Suwon-gun, which marks the spot where Mansei demonstrations took place and the route taken by the demonstrators. It shows that it was a fiery march, since they got from Sopori to Hwasuri in just a single day.
자료가 바로 이제 이재민 목재 배급표라는 거예요. 이거는 19년도에 이제 작성한 거고요. 이재민이 200여가 넘는 사람들이 길거리에 이제는 나앉게 되니까 자신의 산을 개방해서 목재를 나눠줬다는 건데.
A community leader named Hong Han opened up his mountain and handed out free lumber to the victims in the Songsan region who had lost their homes due to Japan's retaliation. This chart is a record of the handout. Because it contains the names and addresses of the 138 refugees from 3 villages in Songsan-myeon, as well as the dates and quantity of the handout and signatures of the recipients, it is a valuable historical material that proves that Japan resorted to arson as a revenge. This is a monument in Songsan that was built to commemorate the March 1st independence movement. Songsan was the starting point of the protest in Hwasong. The demonstration took place on March 28th, a market day in Sagang. The number of demonstrators quickly jumped from 1,000 to 2,000. It was this demonstration that helped the movement spread across the entire city. It was Hong Myeon-ok who led the demonstration in Songsan-myeon. Due to his influence as a highly respected man of a straightforward nature, there wasn't a single pro-Japanese individual in the village of the Hong clan in Songsan. Hong Hyun-yu, his grandson, tells an aching story.
통성을 입고 이제 끌려가셔가지고 이제 서대문까지 가신 거 아니에요. 근데 서대문 가기 전에 이제 치료를 그 이제 수원에서 한 달 정도 치료를 이제 고문을 받고 치료 당하면서 한 있을 때 여기서 그 일본 애들이 안 해가지고 일본 아들한테 안 받겠다 해가지고 한국 그 한의사인가 뭐 사람이 가서 치료를 해줬다라고만 기억이 됐고.
Although he was clearly wounded during the March 1st independence movement and was imprisoned for his involvement, the government still has not recognized Hong Myeon-ok's meritorious deeds.
이제 할아버지가 어떤 정치적인 그 어떤 그 뜻이 있으셨지 않나 생각이 들거든요. 그게 나오셔서 이제 그쪽 지역에서 시한대장을 하시고 저 건국인민위원회 여운용 씨가 했던 데에 위원으로 활동을 하시면서
In the days of the Cold War, it was difficult to even mention his grandfather's name. Now that an era of peace has dawned, this is an issue that we as a nation must resolve.
정말 저희 할아버지가 자기 개인을 위해서 이렇게 3.1 운동을 한 건 절대 아니고 나라를 찾기 위해서 이렇게 3.1 운동의 선봉자로서 희생을 한 건데 국가에서도 인정해 줬으면 하는 그런 바람입니다.
In the afternoon of March 28th, the demonstrators gathered in front of a thatched-roof school, handed out Korean flags, read the Declaration of Independence, and moved to Sagang Market while crying out "Manse." Residents of the 4 nearby villages and the people at the market already knew of the demonstration and all joined in, resulting in the participation of around 1,000 people.
민중들이 와서 막 소리가 더 커지고 합세하니까 사람 많아지고 그러니까 저쪽은 저지하려고 그러다 보니까 너무 힘들고 그러니까 노구치 신사부장이 총을 쐈어요. 여기서 총을 쏜 게 저 앞에. 예, 여기서 밀고 내려가고. 그러니까 하도 저지가 안 되니까 총 쏘고 그러면 예? 저지가 될까 하고 총을 쐈는데 홍면옥 씨가 여기를 맞은 거예요. 어깨 발에 관통하구나. 민중들이 있다가 분노가 해가지고 때려 죽이자 해가지고 도망가고 이 사람들이 그냥 같이 민중들이 쫓아가면서 그 자리에서 붙잡힌 거죠, 노구치가.
Officer Noguchi's gunshot at a peaceful demonstration enraged the crowd, who surrounded him and threw rocks until he went down. Wang Guangyan, another leader of the demonstration in Songsanmyeon, was at the forefront.
그 동네 82가구 거기가 두모자들의 집이었거든요. 우리 그 홍면옥 씨, 홍준옥 씨, 우리 할아버님 홍효선 씨 그런 장면들. 그래가지고 거기 불사질른 거죠. 다 불사질르고 그 나머지 사람들 축제해갖고 이제 다시 또 잡혀갔죠.
28 individuals were imprisoned, 6 were killed by torture and retaliation, and the entire village was turned to ashes. Wang Guangyan's house too was burned down, and he had to rebuild it using the lumber he received from Honghan. The newly built house exists to this day and is currently resided by Wang Uihang, his grandson. Mounted on its cracked wall is a Korean flag and a sign that says this is the house of a man of national merit. An old house where time seems to have stood still.
서대문 혁명사에 계실 때 형 받고 수감 시절에 찍은 사진이에요. 일본 놈들이 찍어놓은 사진이에요. 축하하면 고문하고 뭐하고 어저께 하면 뭐 할아버지한테 더 분명히 이거 만세운동한 사람들 많고 그런데 더 대라 뭐라 하니까 지 할아버지께서 이제 고문에 못 얘기해서 맞아 당신께서 그냥 일을 끊으신 거죠 그냥.
What he remembers of his grandfather as a child is a man who was always sick in bed due to the after effects of biting off his tongue and all the torture he had to endure. Wang Guangyan led the crowd when the Japanese officer was brought to justice. Hong Myung-ok planned the demonstration. Hong Jun-ok participated as a public official at the town office. And Moon Sang-ik read the Declaration of Independence. They led the intense March 1st independence movement of Hwasong. And their sacrifices were placed under the global spotlight when Japan retaliated through the Jiamri massacre.
한국에서 선교활동했던 그 경험 있는 사람들이 적극 나서서 한국 문제를 거론해 달라고 해서 호소를 하죠. 그래서 그때 호소에 귀 기울인 미국 의원이 있었습니다.
This is Washington, D.C., where the basis of world politics is established. The Library of Congress stores petitions sent from around the world, as well as speeches made by members of the Congress. It is home to more than 30 million cataloged books and printed materials in 470 languages. With the public increasingly voicing its support for Korea after the March 1st independence movement, more politicians inside the once neutral U.S. Congress began to show their support. According to the congressional record from June 30th, 1919, Senator Selden Spencer of Missouri submitted Resolution Number 101, claiming that the U.S. had to help Korea in accordance with the Good Office Clause of the U.S.-Korean Treaty of 1882, and demanding the government's response. Senator Spencer decided to submit the resolution due to a letter he received from Fred Dolph, who was the legal advisor to a Korean organization in the U.S. called the Korean Commission to America and Europe. Dolph also sent a document titled The Korean Question. It provided background information on the March 1st independence movement and the establishment of Korea's provisional government, and asked the U.S. government to exert its influence so that Japan would recognize Korea's independence. These were included in the congressional record.
1919년부터 3년 동안 미 의회에서 약 20회에 걸쳐서 일본의 어떤 그런 극동 침략 행위에 대해서 비난하고 어떤 시정을 요구하는 연설이 약 20회 정도에 걸쳐서 있었다고 합니다. 그리고 실질적으로 미 의회에서 한국 독립 관련 이런 문제들이 제기되고 의회에서 발언하고 했던 내용이 미 의회 의사록에 약 한 64페이지 정도 이렇게 현재 기록으로 남아 있다고 합니다.
This is the historical Little Theater in Philadelphia. A century ago, on April 14th, the First Korean Congress was held at this venue for 3 days. Named after the First Continental Congress that took place during the American Revolution, it was a forum where the attendees not only declared Korea's independence, but also devised a plan for founding a new Korea.
이 목적은 필라델피아는 미국 독립운동의 본산지이기 때문에 더 그 뜻을 합리화하기 위해서 이곳에 열렸다 이렇게 생각합니다. 3일 동안 일어났던 그 행사는 상당히 미국 언론의 주목을 받았고 세계에 알리는 효과가 있었다고 봐야 합니다.
Held in the midst of a highly elated atmosphere that was created by the March 1st independence movement, the Korean Congress was attended by not only Koreans, but also American political and religious figures. It was chaired by Philip Json and emceed by Ri Sing-man and Chung Han-gyang. On the first day of the Congress, the senators from Missouri and Nebraska gave speeches of encouragement, and Reverend Tompkins also gave a speech. The minutes from the event were printed and distributed to organizations and institutions in order to publicize it. This was filmed during the parade, which took place on April 16, 1919, on the last day of the Congress. The attendees marched to the Independence Hall carrying a large Korean flag. Thanks to the support of Thomas Smith, the then mayor of Philadelphia, a military band led the parade. The tree in front of the Independence Hall has thickened over a century, and the earnest recital of the Korean Declaration of Independence that took place 100 years ago has been captured in a single photograph. Let's travel back in time to meet an individual who dedicated his entire fortune to his country's fight for freedom. He is none other than Philip Json. This is the house where he lived in Philadelphia until he died, now turned into a museum by his foundation. It tells a story of how a successful businessman became penniless to realize his one true dream of an independent Korea. One can still find traces of how he lived his life to make that dream come true.
I don't know whether there's any interference from Japanese, but at least you know that they were watching, because if you look at the report, they talk about the impact of these groups. And not only First Korean Congress, more importantly, they talk about the impact of Korean Information Bureau, where they use Korea Review, and also more importantly, it specifically mentions impact of the League of Friends of Korea.
This is the Church of the Holy Trinity located in Rittenhouse Square, downtown Philadelphia. This is where Reverend Tompkins, the head of the League of Friends of Korea branch in Philadelphia, used to work and support Korea's independence movement. It was here that the first Congress of the League's Philadelphia branch was held 100 years ago. The church also became the venue for several mass rallies that were held to publicize Korea's fight for freedom. In short, it is an extremely important site in the history of Korea's independence movement.
Reverend Tompkins, I think, was one of the longest serving rectors we had here from 1899 to 1932. It's very rare for a priest to stay anywhere for that long. Again, if we could learn more about his role in helping to establish and support the Korean community in exile and their pursuit of democracy and freedom, I believe that would be a point of great honor and pride for our congregation to know that we had supported our brothers and sisters in Korea.
So if I explain a little bit more about Reverend Dr. Floyd Tompkins, he was the president of the League of Friends of Korea, and his network in not only Philadelphia, but also throughout the Washingtons and so his network in religious communities and also political communities are enormous.
At the Korean Congress held in April, Dr. Json had voiced the opinion that they should recruit a large number of Americans who can support Korea. Reverend Tompkins, who attended the Congress as a speaker, promised him the support he would need to make that become a reality. Then a month later, on May 16, 1919, Reverend Tompkins kept his promise by establishing the first branch of the League of Friends of Korea in Philadelphia and becoming its president. And together with Dr. Json, he set up 21 branches across the U.S. The League of Friends of Korea was active on many fronts, promoting Korea's cause while also pressuring and filing protests against the Japanese Governor General through the Japanese ambassador in the U.S. Dr. Harry Whiting, a member of the League, was very devoted, giving lectures on Korea's situation 266 times across the U.S. This clothes store on Chestnut Street, Philadelphia, marks the spot where the Korean Information Bureau used to stand. As a representative Korean propaganda machine in the U.S., it was founded in April 1919 and was active until 1922. After it was founded by Philip Json, the Bureau began publishing the Korean Review, a monthly journal that included articles related to Korea's independence, reports that criticized Japan, and news of the activities performed by the provisional government in Shanghai, as well as the League of Friends of Korea. It also published an English booklet that justified Korea's fight for freedom, which was highly effective in promoting the cause among the American public. Kim Kyu-sik, who arrived in France on March 18th to attend the Paris Peace Conference, established the Bureau d'Information Coréen in Paris and carried out various propaganda activities. To raise Europe's public awareness of Korea's independence movement and Japan's atrocities, he also printed and distributed 6,500 copies of L'Indépendance de la Corée et la Paix, which was in French, as well as La Corée Libre, a monthly journal that was in English and French. The Continental Trust Building, located at the heart of Washington, D.C., is the site of the Korean Commission to America and Europe, which was founded by combining the Korean Information Bureau and the Korean Mission in Paris. A Korean delegation was sent to the Washington Conference, where issues related to East Asia were discussed after World War I. However, contrary to their high expectations, their journey was fruitless. Then, after the outbreak of the Pacific War, the Commission was given the authority to negotiate with the U.S. by the Korean Provisional Government, thus becoming active again. The town hall, located in downtown New York, was a venue for not just concerts, but also human rights campaigns, commemorative rallies, and debates on social issues. It is in fact the origin of town hall meetings. A commemorative event for the March 1st independence movement was held here on March 2nd, 1921, drawing a crowd of 1,300 people. About 100 of them were Korean residents and the rest Americans, clearly attesting to the influence of the League of Friends of Korea. Since then, the event has been held at this venue every year. The impact of the March 1st independence movement on world history is immeasurable. Clearly stating its status as an independent state through the movement enabled Korea to establish its provisional government. The movement also influenced the May 4th movement in China, while also planting anti-feudal, anti-colonial principles in the minds of small and weak nations. The March 1st independence movement helped Korea become more proactive in its armed struggle against Japan. In short, it was the first courageous step forward.
특히 3.1운동의 결과로 대한민국이 탄생됐단 말이에요. 비록 대한민국 임시정부지만 그 앞 시대는 대한제국시대 아닙니까? 말하자면 봉건적인 군주가 국권과 주권을 갖고 있던 시대에서 이제 백성이 주인인 주권 재민의 민국이 됐잖아요. 이거 혁명입니다.
Following in the footsteps of the state of New York, the city of Aurora in Colorado has designated March 1st as Yukwang-sun Day. During the peaceful demonstrations, the cries of "Manse" spread out rapidly, like fire. The stories of the March 1st independence movement, ingrained in the memories of foreigners, captured in old photographs, and told by the foreign media, all speak of one truth, that Korea is an independent state of free people. Korea's yearning for independence burned fierce, and the hearts of those who supported that yearning were warm and kind. March 1st, 1919, is now a day of history for all.